So here's where our story begins, in a place that doesn't exist on any map you could find today. The people of the Bent Cedar lived in what they called the Valley of the Three Rivers, and honestly, they had a pretty good thing going. 8 generations before the catastrophe we're building toward, when that's roughly 200 years if you're keeping track. These folks had figured out a system that worked, and I want to emphasize that it worked. For 8 generations, their traditional building methods kept people alive through winter after winter. This isn't a story about stupid ancestors who didn't know what they were doing. These were smart, capable people who had developed sophisticated construction techniques that successfully protected their families for 2 centuries. Remember that, because it matters. The longhouses themselves were architectural achievements, even if they'd eventually prove inadequate. The first ancestors, the original builders whose names had been lost to time, established what the people considered sacred proportions. Walls exactly 7 body lengths long. Roof peaks precisely half that height. Support beams spaced at arm's-width intervals. Now, we'd call these engineering specifications, but they called them cosmic truths. The Longhouse wasn't just shelter, it mirrored the universe itself. The roof represented the Sky Father, the floor represented the Earth Mother, and the central hearth embodied the sun's eternal fire. Pretty poetic, right? But here's the thing, whether you call them cosmic truths or engineering specs, they worked for the conditions these people faced. Now let's talk about who could build these structures, because this is where things get complicated in ways that'll become really important later. Only men could build. Full stop. This wasn't presented as cruelty or oppression. Each not. It was cosmic balance. Masculine energy, strong and rigid like oak, provided structural integrity. Women held equally sacred roles, blessing the hearthstones, weaving the sleeping mats, preparing ceremonial foods, separate but equal, right? Except knowledge wasn't equally distributed. 3 master builder families / descendants of those first vision dreamers controlled construction knowledge like warriors guarded weapons. This was intellectual property before that term existed. Master builder Armik, eldest of the Stone Tree clan, could name 43 specific prayers required during beam placement. 43! His son would inherit these secrets. His son's son after him. The knowledge flowed only through approved bloodlines. Let me paint you a picture of what this valley looked like in its prime. 68 longhouses sheltered 230 souls across 7 interconnected clans. Each autumn, when leaves turned to flame across the hillsides, building parties would raise new structures. Men sang work songs passed down through countless generations as they notched beams and lashed joints. Women prepared feasts that turned construction into celebration. Children learned their places early, boys watching beam raising with hungry eyes, girls grinding acorn flour while stealing glances at the mysterious adult world of building. Chief Dakota led the Council of 12 warriors. This guy was legit, 43 winters old, bearing 17 battle scars, had killed 2 bears with obsidian-tipped spears. His words shaped valley life. But even he, this accomplished warrior and leader, bowed to the master builders in matters of construction. That tells you something about how specialized and protected this knowledge was. The system worked beautifully. Roles clear as river water, authority unchallenged, survival assured through proven methods. For 8 generations, these traditional longhouses weathered what everyone considered normal winters. Snow came and melted. Ice formed and thawed. The people endured. But here's where it gets interesting, and a little scary. The climate was changing. Not in some abstract future sense, but right then, incrementally, year after year, and almost nobody noticed. Almost nobody. Old Grandmother Amma had seen 79 winters. Let that sink in for a second. In a society where most people died in their 50s or 60s, she was ancient, and she noticed things. Each winter arrived earlier than the last. Each spring came later. Snow fell heavier. Cold bit deeper. She remembered fragments of stories from her grandmother's time, tales of a winter that devoured the world, a storm that buried entire valleys, a cold that turned mighty warriors into ice statues. The elders had survived that ancient catastrophe, she recalled, but barely. And here's the kicker. Most of those old survival techniques had been forgotten. 8 generations of comfortable, predictable winters had made the people complacent. Why maintain emergency knowledge when emergencies never happen? This is a pattern you'll see throughout history, by the way. Societies that experience long periods of stability often lose the hard-won knowledge that helped their ancestors survive hard times. It's not stupidity, it's human nature. Why waste mental energy remembering how to survive a catastrophe that last happened 200 years ago? But Amma remembered the stories, even if nobody wanted to listen. Into this world, on a night when strange green lights danced across the northern sky, and owls called in patterns that made shamans uneasy, a daughter was born. Her parents, Hunter Napaya and Weaver Lamasi, named her Kiona, Brown Hills, a name suggesting earth and stability. Stability was not her destiny. Young Kiona proved strange from her earliest memories. And I don't mean, oh, she's quirky strange. I mean genuinely unsettling to the adults around her. While other girls learned traditional women's crafts with patient attention, her eyes wandered constantly to the world beyond the work. She watched everything with this intense focus. How pine branches bent under snow while oak branches snapped. How wind swirled around different structure shapes. How ice formed in patterns that seemed to follow invisible rules. Her mother, Lamasi, noticed the odd questions. Why do walls always stand straight? What makes roofs collapse? Could different shapes hold more weight? These weren't normal questions for a young girl to ask. Actually, they weren't questions anyone was supposed to ask. The answers existed in the master builder's protected knowledge, and that knowledge belonged to men, passed father to son through specific bloodlines. The 10-year-old girl asking structural engineering questions? That was weird. By her 10th winter, Kiona had developed a reputation for peculiarity. She could weave baskets with adequate skill, but her fingers worked automatically while her mind lived elsewhere. She ground acorns without complaint, but her gaze tracked the angle of falling snow. Other girls giggled about boys and future marriages. Kiona sketched impossible structures in riverside mud, curves where tradition demanded straight lines, angles that violated sacred proportions. Her younger brother Takara, just 8 winters old, discovered these secret drawings and felt torn between mockery and fascination. The designs looked wrong, but something in them whispered of hidden rightness. Okay, so now we're at the autumn of Kiona's 14th winter, and this is where the warning signs start becoming impossible to ignore. A storm struck harder and earlier than any in living memory. 3 longhouses sustained damage requiring extensive repairs before deep winter arrived. The Builders Guild, essentially Master Builder Armik, and his trained sons, declared the structures had simply aged poorly. Their solution? Rebuild them using identical traditional methods. Replace damaged beams with fresh timber in the exact same positions. Problem solved, right? Kiona watched this repair work with growing horror. She was only 14, so she couldn't say anything. 14-year-old girls had exactly 0 voice in council decisions. But her mind screamed warnings. The weakness wasn't age, but design. Traditional straight walls and steep roofs couldn't shed the increasing snow loads. The same problems would return, magnified. Nobody wanted to hear that. Nobody could hear it, really. The entire social structure depended on the assumption that traditional methods represented perfected wisdom. Questioning that meant questioning everything. M-Macy, gender roles, authority structures, knowledge transmission, social hierarchy. You couldn't pull that thread without unraveling the whole fabric. So the repairs proceeded. The traditional methods were reinforced, and Kiona kept her mouth shut while secretly beginning the most important education of her life. That winter, she learned women's work with new intensity, but she approached it differently than anyone expected. Basket work taught her how flexible materials could support surprising weight when woven properly. Hide tanning showed how moisture and heat could transform rigid materials into pliable ones. Plant medicine knowledge revealed how different substances affected wood's properties. The elder women shared these skills freely, never imagining they were arming a revolution. To them, this was just traditional women's knowledge, oh no, important but separate from the real knowledge of building. They didn't realize that Kiona was synthesizing everything, connecting dots that weren't supposed to be connected, seeing patterns that transcended the artificial boundaries between women's work and men's work. This is one of those historical moments that seems obvious in retrospect but was invisible at the time. Kiona was developing a completely new approach to architecture by combining knowledge that society had artificially separated. But because she was doing it quietly, in the context of acceptable women's activities, nobody noticed. The valley continued its traditional rhythms. Men built, women wove, children learned their predetermined roles. The council met and made decisions based on 8 generations of precedent. Master Builder Ahmek trained his sons in the sacred knowledge. Chief Takoda led with confident authority, and the climate kept changing, slightly, incrementally, in ways that were easy to dismiss as normal variation if you weren't paying very close attention. Old Armor watched the sky with ancient, worried eyes. Kiona studied snow patterns and wind behavior with young, calculating ones. Between them, the eldest and the youngest women who actually paid attention, existed the knowledge that might save the people. If anyone would listen, if pride didn't blind the powerful, if tradition didn't trump survival. Those were very big ifs. The stage was set. The warnings had been given and ignored. The catalyst, a strange young woman who saw the world differently, was growing into her gifts. And somewhere in the north, beyond the mountains where weather was born, a catastrophic storm was gathering strength. But we're not there yet. First, Kiona has to grow up, challenge everything the people believe about who can build and why, and construct something that every expert will declare impossible. That's where we're headed next, to the moment when a young woman stands before a council of warriors and requests permission to do the unthinkable. Chapter 2. Eyes That Saw Tomorrow. So Kiona reaches 15 winters, what we'd call her passage into womanhood, and this should have been the moment when her life path got locked in. Marriage prospects, household establishment, settling into the role society had prepared for her. Instead, her oddness only intensified. Here's the thing about Kiona at 15. She wasn't unattractive by the valley's standards. Strong features, capable hands, adequate dowry potential through her father's respectable standing as a hunter. Young men should have been lining up, and a few tried, I'll give them credit for that. But conversations with Kiona felt wrong. Not in an obvious way you could point to, but in this subtle, unsettling way that made young warriors uncomfortable. She asked questions that shouldn't be asked, like, a young man would try the traditional courtship approach. Maybe complimenting her weaving or talking about the Longhouse he'd inherit someday, and Kiona would respond with something like, why do you think straight walls are stronger than curved ones? Or, have you noticed how snow slides off different roof angles? These weren't flirty questions. These were structural engineering questions. In a society where courtship followed very specific scripts, Kiona was speaking a completely different language. After several awkward courtship attempts ended in mutual relief, the young men escaping to more conventional girls, Kiona returning to her observations of the natural world, I think, the village began calling her the woman who thinks like a man. And I want to be clear, this was not a compliment. This was social categorization, a way of marking her as deviant, as someone who had violated the natural order. Her father, Napaya, struggled with this in ways that honestly break my heart a little. He loved his daughter fiercely. He admired her sharp mind, even if he didn't fully understand it. But he couldn't reconcile these feelings with his role as a respected hunter and council member. His social standing depended on conforming to tradition. When other warriors teased him about his strange daughter, and they did, regularly, he laughed along with them. Imagine that for a second. Laughing at jokes about your own child, because not laughing would be social suicide. He was dying a little inside every time. But what choice did he have? Her mother, Lamasi, felt the pain more deeply, I think, because she understood Kiona in ways her husband couldn't. She recognized her daughter's gifts, even while fearing their consequences. She knew what happened to women who stepped too far outside acceptable boundaries. Late at night, when no one else could see, Lamasi quietly taught Kiona advanced weaving techniques that few knew. The women's knowledge passed only to the most skilled. She couldn't bless her daughter's path openly. That would have been social and probably literal suicide, but she could arm her with tools. Sometimes that's all a mother can do. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, because Kiona found unexpected allies. Not among the young or middle-aged. Those people were too invested in the system, too worried about their standing. No, she found allies among the eldest women, those past 60 winters who had outlived husbands and earned certain freedoms through age. There's this pattern throughout history, where the very old and very young sometimes form alliances against the middle generation. The old have survived long enough to see through social conventions. The young haven't been fully indoctrinated yet. Together, they can challenge things the middle generation takes for granted. Old Amma, remember her? 79 winters, the woman who'd noticed the climate changing, became Kiona's quiet mentor. And Amma knew things. She remembered fragments of old knowledge that the Builders Guild claimed had been lost, but which women had simply kept quietly among themselves. This is crucial to understand. Women didn't lose this knowledge. It was taken from them, or more accurately, declared irrelevant and masculine. But women kept teaching each other anyway, in private, in ways that didn't threaten male authority. They maintained this parallel knowledge tradition for generations. Amma taught Kiona how to identify the strongest timber by reading bark patterns, how to judge wood flexibility by watching how branches moved in wind, how to predict weather changes by watching smoke rise. These weren't magical arts. This was careful observation, accumulated over lifetimes. And this is what makes Kiona special, by the way. It's not that she had some innate genius the men lacked. It's that she had access to both knowledge traditions, the women's observational knowledge that Amma taught her, and the men's structural knowledge she gleaned by watching builders work. She could synthesize what society had artificially separated. By her 18th winter, Kiona had developed what master builder Armik would have called heretical theories. If he'd bothered listening to a woman, which he wouldn't have, she understood that traditional construction created specific failure points. The straight walls acted as rigid levers when wind pushed against them. Replows, all that force concentrated at the joint connections. The steep roof pitch meant snow accumulated rather than sliding off. The weight-bearing system depended entirely on compression, the strength of vertical supports, which became increasingly vulnerable as snow loads exceeded design parameters. In her mind, and this is the revolutionary part, she saw alternative designs, curved walls that deflected wind force rather than resisting it directly, shallower roof angles that shed snow continuously, support systems based on flexible strength rather than rigid compression. These weren't random ideas. These were solutions based on years of observation, synthesis of multiple knowledge traditions, and genuine understanding of structural principles. Kiona had basically invented a new architectural philosophy. She just had no way to test it or prove it to anyone. The winter of her 20th year brought what I'm calling the second warning. An unexpected late-season storm dropped heavy wet snow that collapsed master builder Armik's own supply shelter. Now, the irony here is just chef's kiss perfect. The master builder, the guy who literally controlled all official construction knowledge, whose word was law on structural matters, had his own building collapse. You'd think this would prompt some self-examination, right? Some questioning of methods? Nope. Armik blamed the shelter's location rather than its design. He rebuilt it in a different spot using identical methods and declared the problem solved. Because admitting design flaws would have meant admitting that his father was wrong, that his grandfather was wrong, that 8 generations of master builders might have been optimizing for the wrong conditions. That's too much for most people to accept. It's easier to blame location, bad luck, angry spirits, anything except the fundamental assumptions your entire identity rests on. Kiona knew better, but she stayed silent. Who would listen to a 20-year-old unmarried woman with a reputation for strange thinking? She had exactly 0 authority, 0 platform, 0 voice in the decisions that mattered. Until the spring morning, when she decided to create that voice herself. She appeared before the Council of 12 Warriors and formally requested permission to build her own longhouse. The reaction was instantaneous chaos. Warriors laughed so hard several nearly fell from their sitting logs. Chief Takoda's face cycled through confusion, amusement, and something that might have been anger at such presumption. Master Builder Ahmik's expression suggested he'd just watched a salmon request permission to fly. "Women do not build," Ahmik declared with the patience you'd use on a confused child. "The ancestors forbid it. The spirits would be offended. The structure would fail, bringing shame upon your family and potentially cursing the entire valley. Return to women's work and abandon this foolishness." But here's where Kiona showed real intelligence, not just technical knowledge but political savvy. She'd prepared for this moment. She stood with a warrior's posture, back straight, gaze level, voice steady, and made her case. And she was smart about how she framed it. She didn't directly criticize traditional methods, which would have gotten her dismissed immediately. She didn't claim women were better builders, which would have been suicide. Instead, She framed her request as experiment, as expansion of knowledge, as honoring the ancestors by adapting their wisdom to changing conditions. She invoked old Amma's stories of the ancient catastrophic storm. She suggested that preparedness honored those who survived it. She made it about respect for tradition, not rejection of it. Most importantly, she made an offer the warriors couldn't refuse. If I am wrong, my failure will prove traditional wisdom. If I am right, the people gain new knowledge at no cost to them. Now, Chief Dakota was a warrior. He understood calculated risks, and he saw opportunity in her audacity. Let the strange woman build her foolish structure. When it failed, and it surely would, the lesson would silence future challenges to tradition. Women would learn their place. The social order would be reinforced through practical demonstration. It was a win-win from his perspective. Either she'd fail and prove tradition right, or, impossibly, she'd succeed, and the people would gain knowledge. But he didn't seriously consider that second possibility. Nobody did. "You may build," Dakota announced, with what I can only describe as magnanimous cruelty, "but not here in the valley where your failure might cause problems. Build on the northern ridge, where wind blows hardest and snow piles deepest. Build alone, without help from the master builders or their apprentices." He paused, letting that sink in, then delivered the final condition. "If your woman's design survives even one winter in that exposed place, perhaps, we will consider that you were not completely foolish. More likely, you will abandon this madness before snow flies, marry properly, and will speak no more of it." The council roared with laughter. Kiona's father buried his face in his hands. The shame of this moment would follow him for years. Her mother's expression mixed pride and terror in ways that only mothers can manage. But Kiona bowed respectfully, accepting terms she knew were designed to ensure her failure, and began the most important work of her life. The northern ridge earned its fearsome reputation honestly. Exposed to prevailing winds, receiving the first and hardest storms, accumulating snow that took until late spring to melt, this was where the people drove predators and enemies, not where they chose to live. 2 generations back, a young couple had tried establishing a hunting camp there. Their traditional longhouse lasted exactly 1 winter before collapsing under snow load. They retreated to the valley, and the ridge stood empty ever since. That's what Kiona was walking into. She stood alone on that windswept height, summer sun warm on her face, feeling simultaneously terrified and certain. The location's very hostility would prove her point. If her design survived here, it could survive anywhere. But first, she needed help. Because here's a practical reality that the council had probably counted on. Traditional building required teams of men. Heavy timber, complex joinery, dangerous work at heights. One person alone couldn't do it. The council had essentially told her to perform an impossible task, expecting her to give up when confronted with physical reality. They underestimated 2 things: Kiona's determination and the secret support of women who dared not openly assist. Old Amma came first, climbing that ridge path despite her 79 winters, bringing dried fish and whispered encouragement. Then came Lamasi, Kiona's mother, who spent entire days gathering herbs on the ridge while actually helping measure and mark construction sites. One by one, elder women past 50 winters joined the conspiracy. Women whose husbands had died, women who had earned some independence through age, women who were tired of being told their observations held no value. They came at dawn or dusk when valley eyes looked elsewhere. They brought tools borrowed from husbands' stores, knowledge gained from watching builders for decades, and the fierce satisfaction of women participating in their own quiet revolution. Kiona's brother Takara became her open ally despite their father's fury. He was 15 now, burning with that particular adolescent idealism that makes teenagers do heroic and stupid things in equal measure. Their father Napaya forbade his son from helping his foolish sister. Takara defied him. First time in his life he'd challenged paternal authority. The rift between father and son ran deep. Napaya felt his world crumbling. Strange daughter shaming the family, rebellious son defying him, other hunters offering pitying glances. He couldn't stop them without creating an even greater scene, without admitting he'd lost control of his own household. So he simply stopped speaking to either child. That silence wounded them all. The actual construction revealed Kiona's genius through details that seemed insignificant until they mattered. She selected timber differently than tradition demanded, not the straightest logs but those with slight natural curves, wood that had grown bending toward sunlight. Master builder Armik, watching from the valley with his far-seeing eyes, laughed at her obvious ignorance of proper materials. She built fire-breathing pits and filled them with water-soaked wood, creating steam chambers where she slowly bent supporting beams into curves that made traditionalists shake their heads. She wove cattail mats between structural members, creating a flexible support system that distributed weight like a basket holds grain. Every wrong choice served a calculated purpose that wouldn't become obvious until the storm came. The curved walls would deflect wind, the shallower roof would shed snow continuously. The woven mat reinforcement would provide flexible strength that could bend without breaking. Warriors made regular pilgrimages to the northern ridge specifically to mock her progress. Young warrior Kohana, who had once awkwardly courted Kiona, Ainai, led the mockers with special venom. His hurt feelings had transformed into public ridicule. He called it the coward's cave, claiming its curves revealed feminine weakness. Even friendly observers shook their heads sadly. Healer Kaya, who admired Kiona's plant knowledge, gently suggested she abandon this madness before winter came and left her stranded. But 3 people believed absolutely. Old Armor studied the strange structure with ancient eyes and nodded with satisfaction. Lamasi brought food and encouragement, telling her daughter that women had always known things men dismissed. And Takara worked beside his sister, with the fervor of youth, discovering purpose. As autumn arrived, Kiona completed her longhouse. It looked wrong from every angle. Warriors bet on how many days until wind collapsed it. Master builder Armik publicly declared it an abomination. Chief Takoda smiled confidently. Kiona moved her possessions in, lit the central hearth, and prepared to prove that survival sometimes requires building something the world has never seen. The first snows came early. The curved roof shed snow almost instantly, while traditional longhouses began accumulating white caps. The mockery grew quieter. A few warriors privately admitted that perhaps the strange woman understood something. Master builder Armik dismissed this as coincidence. Real winter hadn't yet arrived. He was right about that. Real winter was coming, and it would arrive like the end of the world. Chapter 3. Building the Impossible. The northern ridge in summer was actually beautiful, in that harsh, unforgiving way that wild places can be. Wildflowers dotted the exposed slopes. Hawks circled overhead, hunting for rabbits, and on clear days you could see 3 valleys over. But beauty wasn't why Kiona was there. She was there because the council had sent her to the one place they were certain would defeat her. Traditional building required teams because the work was genuinely dangerous and physically demanding. Moving logs that weighed more than 2 full-grown men, lifting support beams into position at heights where a fall meant serious injury or death. The joinery work that required 4 hands minimum to hold pieces in alignment while lashing them together. One woman alone shouldn't have been able to do it. The council was counting on that. But Kiona had spent years thinking about this problem, and she developed solutions that the master builders had never needed to consider. Because here's the thing. When you have unlimited labor and traditional methods that work adequately, you never need to innovate around constraints. The Builders Guild had no incentive to develop techniques for solo construction or to question whether their lumber selection criteria were actually optimal. Kiona, working alone with limited help, had to think differently. She started with timber selection, and this is where her years of observation paid off. Traditional building wisdom said you wanted the straightest logs possible, perfectly vertical growth, minimal knots, uniform grain. That made sense if you were building rigid structures that resisted force through pure compression strength. But Kiona was building something else entirely. She selected logs with natural curves, trees that had grown on hillsides, leaning towards sunlight, developing tension wood on one side and compression wood on the other. Master builder Ahmik, watching from the valley with his distant seeing eyes, literally laughed at her obvious ignorance of proper materials. His apprentices joked about it for days. They didn't understand what she was doing. These naturally curved logs, properly oriented, would create walls that deflected force rather than resisting it head-on. They'd bend slightly under wind load, distributing stress across the entire structure rather than concentrating it at rigid joints. The curves weren't weakness, they were engineering. The steam bending process was something she'd developed from women's knowledge about making basketry materials pliable. She dug fire pits and lined them with stones, filled them with water-soaked wood that created dense steam. Then she'd position her curved logs in the steam chambers, weighted with stones, gradually encouraging them into the exact curve she needed. This took forever, by the way. Each beam required days of careful heating and cooling cycles. Traditional building was faster because they just used logs as they came. But speed wasn't Kiona's priority. Getting the curves exactly right was. The warriors who made pilgrimage to mock her progress would stand at a safe distance and shout commentary. "She's cooking the logs like she's preparing dinner." Young warrior Kohana was particularly vicious with his jokes. "The coward's cave grows slower than moss. Perhaps by next summer she'll have 2 walls standing." Kiona ignored them. She'd learned long ago that responding to mockery only encouraged it, but I imagine it hurt anyway. These were people she'd grown up with, men who had once been playmates before society sorted them into separate spheres. Now they travelled specifically to ridicule her. Her mother Lamasi would arrive as the mockers left, bringing food and quiet encouragement. "They're afraid," Lamasi would say. "Men always mock what threatens them. Your success would mean their fathers were wrong, their teachers were wrong, their entire understanding of the world was incomplete. That's terrifying." Kiona understood intellectually, but emotionally, it still stung. Her brother Takara proved invaluable for the heavy lifting. At 15, he was approaching his full strength, and 2 people could accomplish what one couldn't. They developed a system using levers and pulleys, improvised machines that multiplied their force. This was another innovation born of necessity. Traditional building parties used brute manpower. Kiona and Takara used mechanical advantage. The joint work showcased Kiona's synthesis of knowledge traditions. She used lashing techniques from basketry, complex weaving patterns that distributed load across multiple connection points. Traditional joinery relied on precise notching and single-point connections, which created potential failure points. Kiona's woven joints were more forgiving, more flexible, more resilient. Master builder Talus, our mixed middle son, examined her lashing work from a distance one day and declared loudly that it violated sacred proportions and would fail within days. "She's built a giant basket, not a house," he announced to the warriors accompanying him. "The first strong wind will scatter it like leaves." 3 of the elder women helping Kiona that day had to physically restrain her from responding. Old Amma put a gnarled hand on Kiona's shoulder and whispered, "Let your work speak." Words convince no one. Results convince everyone. The support beam placement represented her most radical departure from tradition. Instead of vertical posts spaced at arm's-width intervals, she created a network of supports at varying angles, closer together than tradition required. This created redundant load paths. If one beam failed or weakened, others would automatically share the burden. Traditional design assumed each support beam carried its designated load and nothing more. Kiona's design assumed failures would happen and built in compensatory systems. It was the difference between rigid optimization and flexible resilience. As summer progressed toward autumn, the structure began to take recognizable shape. And okay, it looked weird. Really weird. From the valley below, it appeared like some sort of bulging organic growth rather than a proper geometric building. The walls curved outward, then inward, then outward again in ways that seemed random to casual observers. They weren't random. Each curve served specific aerodynamic purposes that Kiona had deduced from watching how wind moved around natural beaches. The initial outward bulge would catch wind and redirect it upward. The inward curve would create a low-pressure zone that actually pulled the structure down, increasing stability. The final outward curve would shed the redirected wind smoothly away. She'd basically invented principles of fluid dynamics through observation and experimentation, without any theoretical framework or mathematical models. Just years of watching how air moved and thinking carefully about what she saw. The roof presented her biggest challenge because traditional steep pitches were so deeply embedded in the culture's architectural understanding. Roofs were supposed to be steep, 2. That was cosmic truth, like walls being straight or fires being hot. The steep pitch allowed snow to slide off, or so conventional wisdom claimed. Except Kiona had noticed that snow didn't actually slide off steep traditional roofs. It accumulated, building up until it reached critical mass, then occasionally avalanched off in dangerous chunks. The steep angle created friction that held snow in place until weight overcame that friction catastrophically. Her shallower roof angle, maybe 30 degrees instead of the traditional 60, would allow snow to slide continuously as it fell, small amounts shedding constantly rather than large amounts occasionally. It was counterintuitive, which is why nobody had tried it before. The smoke hole placement followed traditional guidelines, because some traditions existed for good reasons. Generations of trial and error had determined optimal smoke evacuation, and Kiona saw no reason to reinvent that particular wheel. Innovation didn't mean rejecting everything. It meant questioning which elements served essential functions and which were merely customary. By the harvest moon, the structure was complete. Kiona stood inside her curved longhouse, looking up at the woven matte ceiling reinforcement, running her hands along the smooth curved walls, feeling the stability of the floor beneath her feet. It looked wrong by every traditional standard, but she knew, with the certainty that comes from years of observation and careful thought, that it was right for the conditions they actually faced. The betting in the valley focused on how quickly it would fail. Some warriors gave it days. Optimists suggested it might last until the first heavy snow. Nobody except the handful of believers thought it would survive the winter. Chief Takoda made a public pronouncement. "We shall observe this experiment with interest. When the foolish woman's structure fails, as the ancestors' wisdom assures us it must, she will return to proper women's work with new appreciation for the boundary between cosmic roles, or she will freeze on that ridge through her own stubborn pride. Either way, the lesson will be learned." Healer Kaya visited Kiona one final time before winter closed the path. She brought medical supplies and advice about frostbite treatment. "I don't want you to die proving your point," Kaya said gently. "When the structure fails, and Kiona, I believe it will fail because I've watched buildings my entire life, promise me you'll come down to the valley immediately. Pride isn't worth your life." Kiona hugged the older woman with genuine affection. "I promise. If I'm wrong, I'll admit it and come down before I freeze." "But Kaya, I'm not wrong." Old Ama's final visit came on a golden afternoon when the air tasted of approaching snow. The ancient woman climbed that steep path one more time, her breathing labored but her eyes bright with determination. She walked through Kiona's completed structure, touching the curved walls with reverent fingers, testing the woven joints with gentle pressure, studying the roof angle with an engineer's assessing gaze. "My grandmother told me stories," Amma said finally, her voice soft with memory. Stories from before her grandmother's time, a winter that buried the world for 3 days and 3 nights. The survivors spoke of one elder who built differently, who saw truth when others saw only tradition. She turned to face Kiona, ancient eyes meeting young ones. "I think the spirit sent those stories forward through time so you would know. You're not the first. Women have always seen things men missed, known things men dismissed. You're simply the latest in a line that stretches back beyond memory." "If such a storm comes," Kiona asked, "will this be enough? Will it actually survive?" Amma smiled, an expression mixing hope and uncertainty. "Nobody knows, child. That's what makes this terrifying and necessary. But I'll tell you this. You've thought more carefully about building in the last 2 years than the Master Builders Guild has thought in the last 2 generations. If anyone can survive what's coming, it's you." The first snows arrived exactly when old Amma had predicted, watching the geese fly south in confused, ragged formations. Light snow at first, barely covering the ground. The valley watched Kiona's longhouse with anticipation bordering on hunger. Many people genuinely wanted her to fail, not from cruelty, but from desperate need to believe their world made sense. The curved roof shed snow almost instantly. The slight accumulation simply slid off in continuous small slides rather than building up. Traditional longhouses in the valley began accumulating white caps. The difference was subtle but noticeable. Master Builder Ahmik dismissed this as coincidence and early season conditions. "Wait until real snow comes," he announced. Wait until wind truly tests that curved weakness. Then we'll see what women's building is worth. By midwinter, though, even skeptics started noticing patterns. Snow on valley longhouses grew concerning, deeper than in previous years at this stage. 2 structures required men to climb up and shovel roofs clear, dangerous work in icy conditions that caused one near-fatal fall. Kiona's curved roof remained nearly bare, snow sliding off continuously, exactly as designed. The mockery from the valley grew quieter, not silent. Pride and tradition die hard, but softer. A few warriors privately admitted that perhaps the strange woman understood something about snow behavior. Young warrior Kohana stopped making pilgrimages to shout insults. His wife Aita later said he'd grown uncomfortable watching Kiona's design work, while knowing he'd mocked it so viciously. He'd invested his ego in her failure, and her success was forcing uncomfortable self-examination. But most people still believed that real winter would vindicate tradition. The severe test hadn't come yet. When it did, the strange curved building would fail, traditional wisdom would be proven, and the social order would be restored. Master builder Amik held firm to this belief. He had to. His entire identity, his family legacy, his life's work rested on the assumption that 8 generations of master builders had been correct. Kiona's success threatened everything he was. Up on the northern ridge, Kiona made final preparations that went beyond normal winter readiness. She stockpiled firewood, far more than traditional calculation suggested necessary. She stored food for herself and potential guests, though she couldn't explain why she felt compelled to prepare for visitors. She wove additional sleeping mats. She reinforced her door covering with triple layers of hide. She checked every joint and lashing in her structure, tightening here, adjusting there, ensuring everything was as perfect as she could make it. She couldn't explain her urgency, even to herself. She simply knew, with bone-deep certainty that defied rational explanation, that something terrible approached. The animal behavior supported this intuition. Deer, vanishing early, squirrels hoarding frantically, bears hibernating weeks ahead of schedule. The shamans performed divinations, reading smoke patterns and animal entrails. Shaman Honia Haka brought troubling visions to the council, Detha, life and death tangled together, safety and danger occupying the same space. Chief Takoda interpreted these through traditional frameworks. Contradictory omens meant the spirits tested them. Strong preparation using proven methods would see them through. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. By morning, ice covered everything, glittering like broken glass. The wind shifted to the north and began to blow with steady, cold determination. By afternoon, the first snowflakes fell, not the usual lazy drift but purposeful, almost aggressive. Kiona stood outside her curved longhouse, watching the northern sky where weather was born. She saw colors she'd never witnessed, strange green-gray hues that made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. The great blizzard was beginning. Everything she'd built, everything she'd sacrificed, everything she believed about how structures should work, all of it was about to be tested against nature's full fury. She went inside, added wood to her fire, and waited for the storm that would either vindicate her wisdom or kill her through her own stubborn pride. In the valley below, families gathered in their traditional longhouses, confident in 8 generations of proven methods, unaware that those methods had been optimized for conditions that no longer existed. The storm would teach them that lesson. Whether they survived to learn from it depended entirely on whether they'd listened to the strange woman on the ridge. Chapter 4. Whispers before the storm. The signs appeared to those who watched for them, invisible to those confident in their preparations. This is a pattern you'll see throughout history. Catastrophes are rarely complete surprises. The warnings are there. People just choose not to see them because seeing would require uncomfortable changes. Old Amma sat by her fire, bones aching with a pain she hadn't felt in decades. She searched her memory for matching sensations, reaching back through 79 winters of accumulated experience. She'd felt this once before, in her 7th winter, the year her grandmother had called the hungry cold. That winter had killed 20 souls and nearly broken the people. Children starved because food stores ran out. Adults froze when traditional shelters proved inadequate. The survivors spoke of it in hushed tones for years afterward, treating it as an aberration, a punishment from offended spirits, a thing that couldn't happen again. But what if it could? What if climate operated in cycles longer than individual memory? What if 8 generations of relatively mild winters had simply been an interlude between catastrophes? Amma couldn't articulate these thoughts with scientific precision. Well, Potes, she didn't have that framework. But she felt the truth in her aching bones, remembered it in fragments of stories passed grandmother to granddaughter across decades. The animal behavior troubled the experienced hunters first, because hunters lived or died by understanding animal patterns. Deer vanished from their usual winter ranges weeks earlier than normal migration patterns suggested, not gradually drifting south as temperature dropped, but fleeing in sudden herds as if escaping predators. Squirrels hoarded acorns with frantic intensity, gathering more than any hunter had seen in decades. One elder hunter counted 17 caches belonging to a single squirrel family, 25. Unprecedented, excessive, suggesting the animals knew something humans didn't. Bears entered hibernation in the 9th moon rather than the 10th. A full month early, bears don't make mistakes about hibernation timing. Its instinct refined over countless generations. When bears hibernate early, smart humans pay attention. Small birds that usually overwintered in the valley disappeared completely. The cheerful sparrows that normally pecked around longhouses for dropped grain, gone. The hardy juncos that weathered normal winters fled south in confused flocks. Even domestic dogs grew restless and strange, whining without apparent cause, refusing to settle, acting like they sensed approaching danger. The shamans performed traditional divinations because that's what shamans did when people got nervous. Shaman Honia Haka, who had trained for 23 years and successfully predicted weather patterns for 17, studied his results with growing unease. The smoke patterns showed contradiction, swirling in 2 directions simultaneously, suggesting forces in opposition. The animal entrails revealed similar confusion. Organs that should have shown clear signs appeared ambiguous. The dreams sent by the spirit world spoke of danger and safety occupying the same space, death and survival intertwined. He brought these troubling visions to the council, laying out his concerns with the careful language shamans used when delivering unwelcome news. The spirits speak in riddles. This often precedes great changes. We should consider additional preparations. Chief Takoda listened respectfully. You didn't dismiss a shaman's interpretations lightly, but he filtered the message through his world view, his understanding of how the world worked. Contradictory omens simply meant the spirits tested them. The solution wasn't radical change, but stricter adherence to proven methods. Strong preparation using traditional approaches would see them through, as it always had. This is such a human pattern, by the way. When faced with warnings that threaten our worldview, we interpret them in ways that reinforce rather than challenge our beliefs. Takoda wasn't stupid or evil. He was doing exactly what most leaders would do, filtering new information through existing frameworks. The council voted to increase traditional preparations, extra firewood, more dried meat, additional maintenance on existing structures using proven techniques. They were preparing hard, just preparing for the wrong thing. They were optimizing for a harsh but manageable winter, not for a civilization-ending catastrophe. Kiona climbed the northern ridge every dawn, studying the sky where weather was born. She saw things she couldn't name, strange green-grey hues in sunrise clouds that made her stomach clench, sunset reds that looked almost purple, stars that seemed to flicker with unusual intensity on clear nights. The wind tasted different, metallic, sharp, like the air itself had transformed into something alien. When she mentioned these observations to healer Kaya during one of the healer's visits, the older woman grew unusually quiet. She'd been taught that such signs preceded the hungry cold of her great-grandmother's time, though she'd always dismissed those teachings as superstition designed to frighten children. Now she wasn't so sure. The old stories speak of a winter that came without warning, Kaya said slowly, choosing words carefully. A winter when the sky changed colors, when stars flickered, when the air itself felt wrong. They say it killed half the people before the spring thaw. Do you believe those stories? Kiona asked. Kaya hesitated. I believe that our ancestors weren't fools. If they remembered something so specifically, across so many generations. Perhaps it happened. Perhaps it could happen again. But believing privately and acting publicly were different things. Kaya returned to the valley and said nothing at council meetings. What could she say? That old wives' tales about star patterns suggested preparing for apocalypse? The warriors would laugh at her, just as they'd laughed at Kiona. The dreams came to multiple people simultaneously, though most didn't share them for fear of appearing foolish or disturbed. Dreams are easily dismissed in daylight among practical people making practical decisions. Kiona dreamed of a great white bear, larger than mountains, that crushed traditional longhouses with casual swipes while passing around her curved dwelling without touching it. She woke with her heart pounding, the image so vivid she could still see it with her eyes open. Old Amma dreamed of her grandmother standing in deep snow, pointing toward the northern ridge and speaking words Amma couldn't remember upon waking. Just the gesture and the overwhelming sense of urgency. Young Takara dreamed of building structures that bent like tree branches in wind, that survived by yielding rather than resisting. When he told Kiona about it, she felt the hair on her arms rise. The spirits were speaking, if anyone would listen. Even Chief Takoda experienced disturbing visions. His great longhouse buried under white silence, his warrior strength meaning nothing against an enemy that couldn't be fought. He woke troubled, performed the traditional cleansing rituals, and dismissed it as anxiety about leadership responsibilities. But collective dreams, multiple people dreaming similar themes simultaneously, that's a thing shamans are supposed to recognize as significant. Shaman Honiahaka noticed the pattern when various people mentioned their nightmares. He brought it to council attention, suggesting these might be spirit warnings. Dreams reflect our fears, Chief Takoda responded. People are anxious about winter, so they dream of snow and danger. This is natural. We address it through confidence in our preparations, not by spreading panic based on nightmares. The council agreed. Dreams were not evidence. Feelings were not facts. Traditional preparation methods had worked for 8 generations. They would work again. Master Builder Armik hosted a feast celebrating another successful building season. 17 structures had been raised or repaired under his guild's supervision, all following the sacred proportions and approved techniques. He gave a speech praising traditional wisdom and obliquely mocking those foolish enough to think they could improve on ancestral knowledge. Everyone understood he meant Kiona, though he never named her. The speech got enthusiastic response. Warriors laughed and agreed. Their longhouses stood strong, built by master craftsmen using methods refined across generations. They were ready for whatever winter brought. The feast was lavish, the kind of celebration communities throw when they're confident about their future. Venison roasted over open fires, acorn cakes sweetened with berry preserves. The young men performed traditional warrior dances, young women sang the harvest songs, children ran wild with the freedom of those who don't yet understand that the world can change catastrophically overnight. Looking back, there's something heartbreaking about that feast. All those people, so confident, so certain in their preparations, so invested in traditional methods, celebrating their readiness for a test they didn't understand was coming. Up on the northern ridge, Kiona didn't celebrate. She made final preparations that weren't traditional at all. She stockpiled firewood, AT, not the traditional careful calculation of what one person would need, but massive quantities that seemed excessive. Her storage shed overflowed with split logs. She created additional stacks protected by hide coverings at multiple points around her longhouse. She stored food for herself and guests she couldn't identify but felt certain would come. Dried venison, ground acorn flour, preserved berries, dried fish, quantities beyond what one person could consume. She kept telling herself it was just being cautious, but some part of her knew she was preparing for refugees. She wove additional sleeping mats, far more than one person needed. She reinforced her door covering with triple layers of hide. She checked every joint and lashing in her structure, tightening here, adjusting there, ensuring everything was as perfect as human effort could make it. She couldn't explain her urgency, even to herself. She simply knew, with certainty, that defied rational explanation, that something terrible approached. Her hands moved with purpose while her mind screamed warnings she couldn't articulate. Old Armor visited one last time before the snow made the ridge path impassable. She climbed slowly, her ancient body protesting each step, but determined to see Kiona's preparations. She studied the stockpiled firewood, the excessive food stores, the extra sleeping mats. "You feel it too," Armor said. Not a question. A statement of recognition. "I don't know what I feel," Kiona admitted. "Just that it's not enough. Nothing feels like enough." Armor nodded slowly. "My grandmother told me stories of a winter that came before her grandmother's time, a winter that buried the world for 3 days and 3 nights, a winter that killed the unprepared and tested even the wise. How did they survive?" "The stories say they survived because one elder refused to follow tradition. She built differently, prepared differently, thought differently." The warriors mocked her. Armor paused, touching Kiona's curved wall with reverent fingers. Then the White Death came, and her wisdom saved those who had scorned her. Kiona felt tears burning in her eyes. "What if I'm wrong? What if I'm just an arrogant woman who thinks she knows better than 8 generations of master builders? What if people die because they followed me instead of tradition?" Armor gripped Kiona's hands with surprising strength for someone so ancient. "Child, people will die either way. Winter kills. Storms kill. That's the nature of life in this land. But you've given people a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. You've given yourself a chance. That's all anyone can do." That night, the temperature dropped sharply, not gradually cooling as autumn faded to winter, but plummeting with sudden viciousness. By morning, ice covered everything, a thin crust that transformed the world into something brittle and treacherous. Kiona stood outside her longhouse, watching her breath crystallize instantly in the air. The ice glittered in weak sunlight like broken glass, beautiful and terrible. The wind shifted to the north. In this region, north wind meant serious cold, serious snow. But this wasn't the usual gradual shift of changing weather patterns. This was immediate, complete, like someone had thrown a switch. By afternoon the first snowflakes fell. Not the usual lazy drift of early winter snow, fat flakes floating gently down. These were small, hard, purposeful. They fell with determination, almost aggression, driven by wind that was already strong and growing stronger. By sunset, the snow fell harder. Visibility dropped. Temperature continued plummeting. The wind's voice rose from whisper to moan to howl. By midnight, the storm had fully arrived. Snow fell in sheets that made visibility beyond a few body lengths impossible. Wind screamed with a voice that made humans feel small and insignificant. Temperature reached levels that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The great blizzard had begun. In the valley, families woke to the storm's fury and felt the first stirrings of unease. This wasn't normal heavy snow. This was something else entirely. But their longhouses stood strong, built by master craftsmen using proven methods. They added wood to their fires, gathered children close, and told themselves everything would be fine. On the northern ridge, Kiona added wood to her fire, checked her supplies one final time, and settled in to wait. She didn't know yet that warriors who had mocked her would come seeking shelter. She didn't know that her fool's longhouse would become a refuge. She didn't know that the next 3 days would destroy 2/3 of the valley's structures and transform her from outcast to savior. She just knew that the test had arrived. Everything she'd built, everything she'd sacrificed, everything she believed about how structures should work, all of it was about to face judgment from the most merciless judge of all. Nature doesn't care about tradition. Nature doesn't care about social conventions or gender, roles or 8 generations of precedent. Nature only cares about what actually works. The storm would prove what worked and what didn't. The storm would separate wisdom from convention, survival from pride, truth from comfortable lies. For 3 days and 3 nights, nature would teach lessons written in frozen bodies and collapsed dreams. The people of the Bent Cedar were about to learn which of their beliefs served survival and which served only certainty. Chapter 5. 3 days that changed everything. The first day arrived with what I can only describe as deceptive ordinariness. Heavy snow, sure, but manageable. Valley families woke to the storm, tended their fires, ate morning meals, and discussed the weather with more curiosity than concern. This is how most catastrophes begin, by the way, not with obvious apocalypse, but with something that looks almost normal until suddenly it isn't. These people had weathered countless winters. They'd seen heavy snow before, survived cold snaps, endured harsh conditions. This seemed harder than most, but nothing unprecedented. Just another winter storm that would blow through in a day or two, leaving them with good stories to tell around fires. By mid-morning, snow depth reached knee-height. People started paying more attention. That was fast accumulation for just a few hours. But okay, sometimes early-season storms dumped quickly then tapered off. No reason to panic yet. By noon, the snow passed waist height. Now, people were concerned. The wind had picked up significantly, creating drifts that made travel between longhouses difficult. Families that had planned to visit neighbors decided to stay home. Better to wait it out in comfort than risk getting lost in whiteout conditions 20 paces from your door. By afternoon, as daylight began to dim, the wind began to howl with a voice that made children cry and warriors reach instinctively for weapons. This is a primal human response, FCON. When nature sounds angry, we want to fight something. But you can't fight wind, you can't negotiate with snow, you can only endure or fail. Chief Dakota's Great Longhouse, structure, the largest structure in the valley, built by master builder Armic's father, specifically to showcase the guild's mastery, ISR, began showing strain as afternoon darkened toward evening. That traditional steep roof, which everyone agreed was perfect for shedding snow, was accumulating weight faster than it could shed. The physics here are important to understand. A 60-degree roof pitch creates significant friction between snow and surface. Snow doesn't slide off continuously, it builds up until it reaches critical mass, then avalanches. But in a storm dumping snow this fast, that critical mass arrives quickly and repeatedly. Each avalanche is followed by new accumulation. The roof never gets a chance to fully clear. Chief Dakota noticed the central support beam, roof beam, the massive log that carried the roof's peak weight, 0 pp, beginning to groan. Just subtle sounds at first, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what structural stress sounded like. He ordered women and children to the edges of the longhouse, away from the center where the roof peak carried maximum load. He maintained his warrior composure, speaking calmly, projecting confidence. But privately he watched that central beam with growing dread. If it failed, the entire roof would cascade down. Everyone inside could be crushed. Master Builder Ahmic's own home faced similar stress. His wife, Helona, noticed the subtle downward sag of the roofline. She'd lived in this structure for 23 years, knew every beam and joint intimately. She could see the change, feel the wrong tension in the air. She said nothing. Questioning her husband's construction would be unthinkable, both socially inappropriate and pointless. The house was already built. Either it would hold, or it wouldn't. She simply moved their children's sleeping area closer to the door, preparing an escape route without explicitly acknowledging why. Up on the northern ridge, Kiona's curved longhouse faced the storm's full fury. The ridge took the worst of everything: strongest winds, heaviest snow, coldest temperatures. This was why the council had sent her there. They'd been certain the exposure would defeat her. But wind that would have hammered straight walls like battering rams instead flowed around the curved structure like water around a river stone. The aerodynamic principles Kiona had observed in nature and incorporated into her design were working exactly as she'd theorized. The wind found no flat surfaces to push against, no sharp corners to create turbulence. It just slid around. Snow that would have accumulated on a 60-degree roof instead slid continuously off the 30-degree slope, small amounts shedding constantly rather than building to catastrophic weight. The shallow angle everyone had mocked as too weak to be a real roof was proving perfect for exactly these conditions. The flexible support system absorbed stress that would have snapped rigid beams. When wind gusts hit particularly hard, the entire structure flexed slightly, bending but not breaking, distributing force across the whole framework rather than concentrating it at rigid joints. Inside, Kiona maintained her fire and waited. She could hear the storm's fury, feel the building move subtly as it flexed. But the movements were controlled, expected, designed. This was the structure doing exactly what she'd built it to do. She listened to the wind's song and the snow's relentless whisper, and she thought about the people down in the valley who had mocked her. Were they safe? Were their traditional longhouses holding? Part of her wanted vindication, wanted to be proven right, but a larger part just wanted everyone to survive. The second day broke with no break in the storm. Actually, that's not quite accurate. The second day didn't really break at all. There was no dawn, no sunrise. Just a gradual shift from black darkness to grey darkness as hidden sun rose somewhere beyond the blizzard. If anything, the storm had intensified overnight. Temperature had plummeted until breath froze instantly into ice crystals that hurt to inhale. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. Wind velocity reached levels that made standing upright nearly impossible for anyone who ventured outside. Warriors who had to check livestock or gather firewood returned nearly frozen, reporting that the animal shelters were buried, the livestock likely dead. The world transformed into a white hell where directions ceased to exist. One young warrior, Maka, got disoriented between his longhouse and the storage pit barely 10 paces away. He wandered in circles for what he later said felt like hours but was probably only minutes, until he literally stumbled into his own door by pure luck. That's when people started to understand. This wasn't a bad storm. This was something else entirely. By mid-morning of the second day, the first longhouse failed. The structure belonged to Hunter Sahale and Weaver Mikasi, a couple in their 30s with 4 children. They'd built it 11 years earlier, using traditional methods, had maintained it properly, had done everything right by conventional standards. The roof didn't collapse dramatically, no sudden catastrophic failure. Instead, it sagged slowly, incrementally, giving them precious minutes of warning. They heard the beams groaning, saw the ceiling lowering, and had just enough time to grab their children and flee to the storage pit beneath the main floor. They huddled in that frozen earth cavity, covered in every fur and hide they owned, sharing body heat while the world above them groaned and broke. The roof came down gradually over the course of maybe 20 minutes, crashing in sections, until their home was reduced to broken timber and compressed snow. Other families heard the distinctive crack and crash of structural failure. They knew one of their number had lost shelter. In normal winter, that meant hardship. In this storm, that could mean death. The failure started a cascading psychological crisis. If one traditional longhouse could collapse, any might. Every family began looking at their own structures with new suspicion. People started noticing things they'd ignored before. That slight sag in the roofline, that small crack in a support beam, those creaking sounds that had always been there but now seemed ominous. Some families began improvised reinforcement. They used storage baskets, sleeping platforms, anything solid to prop up sagging beams. It was desperate, improvised engineering that probably helped in some cases, but created new problems in others. When you start adding random supports without understanding load distribution, sometimes you make things worse. Other families prepared emergency bundles, essential supplies they could grab if forced to flee suddenly. But flee where? In whiteout conditions, with temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, leaving shelter was almost certain death. They were trapped, watching their own roofs with the awful knowledge that the only thing keeping them alive might kill them. The second roof failed at noon. This belonged to young warrior Kohana and his new wife Aita, married just 2 moons earlier. They'd moved into a longhouse built 15 years prior by master builder Talus, using textbook traditional methods. Everything by the book, everything according to sacred proportions. The couple was young, strong, confident. Kohana had mocked Kiona's curved design most viciously, calling it the work of a coward who couldn't build properly. He'd led the pilgrimages to the northern ridge specifically to shout insults. He'd invested significant ego in her failure. Now his own roof was collapsing while he and Aita struggled to gather essential supplies. A falling beam caught Kohana's shoulder, glancing blow, not enough to break bone but enough to leave him injured and utterly ashamed. His coward's cave mockery echoed in his mind as his own properly built traditional structure failed around him. The couple faced an impossible choice: remain in the wrecked structure and almost certainly freeze to death, or attempt the ridge path in blizzard conditions to reach the only intact shelter they knew, Kiona's fool's Longhouse. Pride warred with survival instinct. Kohana, injured and humiliated, wanted to seek any other option, but there was no other option. Most valley longhouses were showing dangerous stress. The few that seemed stable were already overcrowded with refugees from failed structures. The northern ridge was their only real chance. Aita made the decision for both of them. "We go now," she commanded, wrapping her injured husband in every hide they owned, "or we die proud and frozen. I choose living over pride." The journey from valley floor to northern ridge normally took less than half an hour. In the blizzard, it became an epic of survival that they'd remember until death. They roped themselves together with braided leather line, staying in contact when visibility dropped to nothing. They fell repeatedly in waist-deep drifts that seemed determined to bury them. They lost the path twice and had to backtrack using Aita's superior sense of direction. Aita, she'd gathered herbs on these slopes her entire life, knew them in ways Kohana didn't. They nearly turned back when halfway up, convinced they would die on the exposed slope. But Aita pushed forward with determination born of desperation. Her husband was injured. The valley offered only death. The ridge offered at least a chance. When they finally reached Kiona's curved doorway, they literally collapsed in the entrance, nearly dead from exposure. Their outer garments were frozen solid. Ice coated their faces. They couldn't speak through frozen lips. Kiona pulled them inside, without a word of judgment or triumph. No, I told you so, no gloating about the mockery Kohana had heaped on her. She just stripped off their frozen outer garments with efficient care, wrapped them in dry furs, fed them hot broth, made from dried venison and herbs. Kohana's face burned with shame, seeking shelter from the woman he'd mocked most cruelly. But when he tried to apologize through chattering teeth, Kiona simply smiled gently and said, "Welcome. You're safe here. That's all that matters." The second afternoon brought two more structural failures in quick succession. The domino effect had started. As each longhouse collapsed, snow displaced from that structure would settle on neighbors, increasing their burden, hastening their failure. It was a feedback loop that fed on itself. Master Builder Ahmik watched this cascade with horror, finally understanding the terrible truth. His guild had optimized for normal conditions while leaving the community vulnerable to abnormal threats. Every structure he'd ever built followed the same principles. Every structure faced the same failure mode. The entire valley stood on the brink of catastrophe, and it was because of methods he'd defended, taught, and insisted were sacred. Chief Takoda made the hardest decision of his leadership: evacuate. Families would have to abandon their homes before roofs collapsed and seek refuge in whichever structures seemed most stable. He designated 3 gathering points based on which longhouses appeared least stressed. Families began the terrifying migration through waist-deep snow between structures barely 30 paces apart. They carried children and precious supplies, racing against time and collapsing roofs. People died during these short journeys: elders who couldn't move fast enough, children who slipped from frozen hands, adults who got disoriented and wandered the wrong direction. But gathering in fewer structures only delayed the inevitable. Concentrated weight of multiple families, combined with continuing snow accumulation, simply accelerated the failure timeline. You couldn't solve a fundamental design problem by adding more load to the same design. By evening of the second day, one of the designated gathering points, Elder Hunter, Chesmu, Elder, groaned and began to sag. The families inside, already traumatized from evacuating their own homes, scrambled out in panic. Some sought other structures, some simply dispersed into the storm, desperate to escape. That's when the exodus toward the northern ridge began in earnest. The rumor spread through the valley like wildfire despite the blizzard. The strange woman's curved longhouse stood undamaged on the ridge. It was sheltering refugees. It was surviving what traditional structures couldn't. Warriors remembered their mockery and felt sick with shame, but survival trumped pride. Families roped themselves together and began the treacherous climb. Some made it, some turned back when the path proved too dangerous. Some simply vanished into the white chaos. Whether they perished, found other shelter, or eventually reached the ridge. No one would know until the storm passed. By the second night, Kiona's Longhouse sheltered 17 souls. Herself, Kohana, and Aita, 2 families with young children, several elder women including old Amma, who had attempted the ridge climb before the storm worsened, and eventually Kiona's own brother Takara with their parents. Napaya arrived, last and most reluctantly. His own home had developed dangerous stress fractures. His pride lay shattered worse than any roof. He'd forbidden his son from helping build this structure. He'd supported the council's decision to exile his daughter to the ridge. He'd laughed at jokes about her foolishness. Now he stood at her door, literally begging for shelter, unable to meet her eyes. Kiona embraced him anyway. She just held her father while he wept, welcoming him with tears of relief that he was alive, that he'd swallowed his pride in time, that she could save at least this one stubborn man she loved. The third day dawned with no end in sight. The storm raged with undiminished fury. By now, 2/3 of valley longhouses had failed completely, or been abandoned as unsafe. The bodies of livestock emerged from drifts, frozen horses, dogs, the clan's treasured goats that had been carefully bred for generations. The food storage pits, buried under snow measured in body lengths, became inaccessible. Families scattered among the few remaining structures, and Kiona's ridgetop refuge faced a terrifying reality. If the storm continued much longer, starvation would kill those the cold hadn't taken. Inside the curved longhouse, 17 people existed in circumstances that should have produced conflict, but instead created unexpected community. The structure was crowded, far more bodies than it was designed for. They were rationing supplies carefully. Privacy was non-existent. Everyone could smell everyone else. Children cried. Adults snapped at each other from stress. But they were alive. Kohana, his injured shoulder tended by Kiona's herb knowledge, helped manage the fire rotation. He couldn't do heavy work, but he could feed logs, bank coals, keep the hearth alive. He did it with the focused intensity of a man trying to atone. Master Builder Talus, Armic's middle son, who had fled his father's house when the great beam cracked, MCT, studied Kiona's joint work with fascinated horror. He kept touching the woven lashings, testing the curved beams, examining the flexible support system. "This shouldn't work," he muttered. "By everything I was taught, this shouldn't work. But it does. It works better than anything I've ever built." Old Amma told stories to frighten children, tales of ancient survival and the resilience of the people. Stories of how their ancestors had endured worse and emerged stronger. Her ancient voice, cracked and worn, somehow soothed terror in a way younger voices couldn't. Lamasi and other women prepared meals from pooled supplies, making meager resources stretch. They ground acorn flour, soaked dried meat until it was soft enough to chew, rationed berries like they were precious stones. The women's traditional skills in resource management were literally keeping everyone alive, and Kiona moved among them all, no longer the outcast, no longer the strange woman, simply the leader whose wisdom had saved them. People asked her questions about the structure, about her design principles, about how she'd known this would work. She answered patiently, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. The third afternoon brought the storm's climax. Wind reached velocities that made even the curved walls shudder. Snow accumulated faster than the shallow roof could shed it completely. For the first time, Kiona's design showed real strain. She watched the support beams with careful eyes. They bent more than they had before. The woven mat system showed stress, accumulating snow on the roof, pressed down with weight that approached the design limits. But the redundancy she'd built into the structure meant there was no single failure point. When one beam bent too far, others automatically took more load. When one section of woven reinforcement showed maximum stress, adjacent sections compensated. The system flexed and adjusted and held. Barely. In the valley, the final great collapse occurred. Chief Takoda's magnificent longhouse, Ayaye, the pride of the people, the showcase of Master Builder Ahmik's family legacy, the symbol of traditional authority and proven methods, Elaye, gave way at last. The central beam, supporting more weight than any design could handle indefinitely, cracked with a sound like thunder. Warriors inside, said later it sounded like the world breaking. The entire roof cascaded inward, sending snow and debris crashing down in a wave of destruction. The chief and his family, who had moved to the storage pit when collapse seemed imminent, survived physically. They emerged to find their home, NJ, the symbol of everything they believed about how society should work, reduced to broken timber and buried dreams. The third night arrived with the storm still raging. 17 souls in Kiona's Longhouse, unknown numbers scattered in the few remaining valley structures, unknown numbers dead, from exposure, from collapsing structures, from getting lost in whiteout conditions, from injuries sustained during evacuation. But somewhere after midnight, those with sharp ears noticed a change. The wind's voice shifted tone, dropped pitch slightly. The snow's intensity decreased fractionally. These were subtle changes, easy to miss. But to people who'd been listening to the storm for 3 days straight, the difference was unmistakable. By dawn of the 4th day, the storm began to break. The snow stopped falling first, then the wind decreased. By mid-morning, clouds started to thin. By afternoon, the sun emerged, weak and distant, but unmistakable. A pale disk in a pale sky, the most beautiful thing anyone had seen in their entire lives. The survivors emerged into a transformed world. Snow deeper than 2 standing men buried much of the valley. 17 of 23 longhouses had collapsed or sustained catastrophic damage. The 6 structures that remained intact showed stress fractures and dangerous weaknesses. Nobody trusted them. The body count climbed as people searched collapsed structures. 47 souls, some from exposure when structures failed, some from injuries during collapse, some from cold when separated from shelter, some from the desperate evacuations between failing buildings. 3 council members dead, master builder Amik's wife Helona and their youngest daughter crushed when their home collapsed. 7 children under 10 winters, 23 adults who represented irreplaceable knowledge and skill. The people who had numbered 230 souls now counted just 183 survivors. An entire generation's growth erased in 3 days. But on the northern ridge, visible from the valley like a banner of defiance against nature's fury, Kiona's curved longhouse stood essentially undamaged. Snow had been shed, walls remained true. The structure that warriors had mocked, that master builder Amik had called an abomination, had proven itself the only design that could survive the great blizzard's fury. The fool's longhouse had saved everyone within it, and through its example it would eventually save the entire people. But first, they had to rebuild. Not just structures, but beliefs, traditions, and understanding of how survival sometimes requires the courage to build what the world has never seen. Chapter 6. Rebuilding the People. The immediate aftermath brought chaos tempered by grief. This is the reality of disasters. The storm ends, but the trauma continues. People searched collapsed structures for those who hadn't been accounted for, finding bodies frozen in final embraces, a mother and child holding each other, an elder who'd been too slow to escape, 2 warriors who'd tried to rescue someone and been caught in the collapse. The death count climbed, 47 souls, 3 council members, master builder Amik's wife Helona and their youngest daughter, 7 children under 10 winters, 23 adults who represented irreplaceable knowledge, hunters who knew the best game trails, weavers who understood complex patterns, storytellers who remembered tribal history, healers who could identify hundreds of medicinal plants. You can't easily replace that kind of knowledge. It accumulates over lifetimes. When it dies with the person, it's just gone. The people who had numbered 230 now counted 183 survivors. An entire generation's growth erased, families torn apart, children orphaned, the social fabric shredded. The first council gathering after the storm occurred not in Chief Takoda's ruined longhouse, but in Kiona's curved structure on the ridge. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. These proud warriors, who had forbidden women from construction knowledge, now held their most important meeting in a woman's foolish design. Chief Takoda had aged 10 years in 3 days. His face showed lines that hadn't been there before. His eyes held a haunted quality that would never quite leave. He'd lost his home, his certainty, and several close friends. But he'd gained something too: humility. He opened with words that would be remembered for generations. The Spirit sent us a teacher, and we called her fool. They showed us wisdom, and we clung to pride. They offered survival, and we chose tradition. The storm has judged us, and we were found wanting. Now we begin again, not by pretending the old ways were perfect, but by honoring what worked and changing what failed. Master Builder Ahmik struggled to find words. His entire worldview had shattered along with his wife's body and his family's legacy longhouses. The man who had controlled construction knowledge like a jealous god, who had defended traditional methods as cosmic truth, now had to admit comprehensive failure. His voice, usually commanding, emerged broken. I have built for 37 years using methods my father taught, that his father taught him, stretching back 8 generations. Every structure I raised followed sacred proportions and approved techniques. In 3 days, the storm destroyed them all. He paused, looking at Kiona with eyes raw from weeping. I was wrong. We were wrong. The knowledge I hoarded as family treasure should have been shared, questioned, improved. My pride killed my wife. I will not let it kill anyone else. This is a remarkable moment when you think about it. A man completely dismantling his own authority, admitting fundamental error, surrendering the monopoly his family had held for generations. Some men would have doubled down, found ways to blame, the storm or the spirits or bad luck. Ahmik chose truth over comfort. What followed was the most remarkable knowledge transfer in tribal memory. Kiona, overnight transformed from outcast to master builder, began teaching anyone willing to learn. Warriors, women, young people, even children. She didn't restrict knowledge or create new guilds or establish new hierarchies. She just taught. She explained curved wall principles using demonstrations with bent branches. See how the straight branch snaps under force? Now watch the curved branch. It bends, distributes the force, springs back. Buildings can do the same thing. She showed snow load calculations by piling weights on different roof angles, made the invisible visible, made the theoretical practical, made the revolutionary accessible. But here's where Kiona showed real wisdom beyond mere technical knowledge. She understood that forcing too much change too quickly would break the people as surely as the storm had broken their homes. Humans need continuity even in revolution. We need to feel connected to our past even as we move toward new futures. So she framed her innovations not as rejection of ancestral wisdom, but as extension of it. The first builders were brilliant, she would say. They created structures that survived 8 generations of normal winters. But the climate has changed. Our ancestors would have adapted. They were smart, resourceful people. We honor them by doing what they would have done. Observe, think, improve. This framing mattered enormously. It let people adopt new methods without feeling like they were betraying their heritage. It preserved respect for ancestors while enabling necessary change. The actual reconstruction became a massive communal project that transformed social structures as profoundly as it rebuilt physical ones. Traditional gender divisions softened by necessity. Women worked alongside men in construction parties because they literally didn't have enough men to do it the old way. And guess what? Women proved perfectly capable of construction work when given the chance. Young warrior Kohana became one of Kiona's most dedicated students. The man who had mocked her most viciously now publicly acknowledged his error and worked to master the new techniques. His wife Aita joined construction teams, her quick hands perfect for the detailed lashing work the new designs required. There's something beautiful about people who can admit they were wrong and change. Kohana could have nursed his wounded pride, made excuses, blamed circumstances. Instead, he owned his error and became part of the solution. The building process synthesized old and new in ways that satisfied both conservatives and innovators. Traditional ceremonies still blessed new structures, prayers to the ancestors, offerings at the 4 directions, sacred songs during beam placement. The rituals remained even as the techniques transformed. Master Builder Ahmik's surviving sons worked alongside Kiona. They contributed traditional joint work while learning her innovations. The resulting designs honored heritage while ensuring survival. This wasn't complete revolution. It was synthesis, evolution, adaptation. But not everyone adapted gracefully. Warrior Takala had lost his wife and 2 children when his longhouse collapsed. He'd refused to seek Kiona's refuge out of pride, convinced that traditional structures would hold, that the woman's design would fail spectacularly. His family had died for his certainty. He became bitter and angry. He blamed Kiona for not warning more forcefully, ignoring that she'd had no authority to warn anyone. He blamed the council for allowing her to build at all, as if her building had caused the storm. He blamed everyone except himself for gambling with his family's lives and losing. He argued loudly in council that the storm was divine punishment for allowing a woman to violate cosmic order. That returning to pure traditional methods would restore the spirit's favor. That adapting to Kiona's innovations would invite further catastrophe. A handful of warriors, those most invested in traditional masculine authority, those who'd built their entire identities around being protectors and builders, echoed his arguments. Change threatened them personally. If women could build, if traditional methods were wrong, if authority came from wisdom rather than gender, what did that mean for them? Chief Takoda faced this resistance with wisdom earned through catastrophic loss. He didn't order compliance or dismiss legitimate grief. Instead, he proposed a practical test. Let those who wish to build traditionally do so. Let those who wish to follow Kiona's methods do so. When the next heavy winter comes, we will see which approach serves the people better. Truth will prove itself. This was politically brilliant. He acknowledged dissent without letting it paralyze action. He framed choice as legitimate, while letting natural consequences provide answers. But most survivors had learned lessons written in frozen bodies. They chose Kiona's methods from raw, pragmatic calculation. Her design had worked when everything else failed. One by one, 17 new structures rose that first autumn, all incorporating curves, shallow roofs, flexible support systems. The valley's architecture transformed, and with it, something deeper shifted in the people's understanding of knowledge, authority, and survival. The resource challenges proved harder to solve than design principles. The storm had destroyed food caches, killed livestock, buried stored seeds under snow that wouldn't fully melt until late spring. The surviving population faced potential starvation unless they received help. Chief Takoda, swallowing considerable pride, sent messengers to the 6 nearest communities requesting assistance. He offered knowledge in exchange, a spy, specifically, offering to teach Kiona's building methods in return for food supplies. The Residi. Responses revealed that the Great Blizzard had struck widely. 3 neighboring settlements had experienced severe damage, though none as catastrophic as the people of the Bent Cedar. 2 settlements reported only moderate impacts, protected by geography, or lucky enough to miss the storm's worst fury. 1 settlement sent no response. Messengers returned, reporting the entire community had perished. 43 souls lost when their shelters failed, and freezing temperatures killed even those who survived initial collapse. An entire community, just gone. News of Kiona's successful design spread rapidly. Within a single winter, representatives from 11 regional communities journeyed to the valley to study the curved longhouse. The woman who thinks like a man became the builder whose wisdom saved her people. Her reputation spread far beyond her home valley. Stories told at trade gatherings, techniques demonstrated at regional councils, her name spoken with respect that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. But Kiona herself struggled with her transformation from outcast to legend. She'd never sought fame, only to build something that worked. She found the attention exhausting, the expectations overwhelming. People treated her like some kind of prophet or genius. They asked her opinions on everything, not just building. Late nights, she would sit with her mother Lamasi, weeping from the weight of it all. "I didn't want to be special," she whispered. "I just wanted people to listen." Lamasi held her daughter with fierce maternal love. "The spirits use us for their purposes, not ours. You wanted to build a better shelter. They used you to teach the people humility, adaptation, and survival. Your burden is heavy, but your gift has saved lives." That matters more than your comfort. By spring, the valley had stabilized. 17 new structures provided adequate shelter. Food from neighboring settlements prevented starvation. The population remained diminished. 183 souls, where 230 once lived, but stable. The psychological wounds ran deeper than physical ones. Children woke screaming from nightmares of collapsing roofs. Adults flinched at heavy snowfall. The survivors carried trauma that would mark them for life. But they endured. That was their nature and their pride. The most profound change came in how knowledge was held and transmitted. The Builders Guild, which had monopolized construction secrets for 8 generations, formally disbanded. Master Builder Armick proposed creating a new system where building knowledge was community property, taught to any who showed aptitude regardless of gender or bloodline. Knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted, he declared. The storm taught us this lesson in blood. We will not forget. Kiona became the first official master builder under the new system, with Ahmick and his sons serving as senior apprentices. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but survival mattered more than ego. Young people, especially girls who had never imagined building as possible, flocked to training sessions. The valley's future would look different than its past, not because tradition was rejected, but because survival demanded evolution. Chapter 7. Legacy. Written in curved walls. 20 winters passed like water flowing down stone. The people of the Bent Cedar numbered 205 souls by the winter of Kiona's 40th year, not quite recovered to pre-storm levels but growing steadily. The valley had healed its physical wounds. The deeper changes proved more permanent. Every longhouse now incorporated Kiona's innovations, though diverse variations had emerged. Some builders preferred more pronounced curves, while others used gentler slopes. Some relied heavily on woven mat reinforcement, while others developed alternative flexible support systems. The next generation had learned basic principles and then innovated within them. The culture had shifted from rigid adherence to tradition toward understanding of underlying concepts that allowed creative adaptation. This is how real progress happens, by the way, not through complete revolution, but through evolution that preserves what works while improving what doesn't. Kiona herself had become something she never imagined, a teacher, leader, and unwilling symbol of cultural transformation. Her hair showed grey now at 40 winters. Her hands bore scars from 3 decades of construction work. Her face carried lines earned through responsibility. She trained apprentices from 11 different regional communities, spreading wisdom that synthesized her innovations with local traditional knowledge. But Kiona never stopped observing, questioning, improving. On cold winter nights, she would study how snow fell on different roof angles, how wind patterns shifted with seasonal changes, how ice formed in ways that suggested structural vulnerabilities she hadn't anticipated. She developed techniques for insulating walls using packed moss and clay that reduced firewood consumption by nearly half. She experimented with smoke hole designs that drew more efficiently. She remained what she'd always been, a woman who watched the world carefully and built according to what she saw. The Great Blizzard had never repeated at that catastrophic intensity, though several hard winters tested the new designs. Each test provided data, revealed weaknesses, suggested improvements. Kiona insisted on documenting failures as carefully as successes. When apprentice builder Melly's experimental ultra-shallow roof proved too flat and accumulated dangerous snow load, Kiona praised her for attempting innovation while analyzing why the design failed. "We learn more from what doesn't work than from what does," she would say. "The storm taught us that refusing to learn is refusing to survive." The political transformation proved partial and imperfect. Cultures evolve but rarely revolutionize completely. Women could now become builders, but men still dominated the craft numerically. The council included 2 women among its 12 members, unprecedented but hardly equal. Some warriors still grumbled about the loss of old ways, and taught their sons that men's traditional roles had been undermined. Young warrior Takala, who never forgave the cultural changes he blamed for his family's deaths, raised 3 sons in deliberate opposition to Kiona's influence. His eldest, Nashoba, refused to learn building from a woman and apprenticed with one of Master Builder Ahmick's sons instead. He learned a hybrid style that incorporated some innovations while rejecting others. Kiona accepted this without bitterness. Not everyone would embrace change. That was human nature. Her personal life had followed unexpected paths. She never married in the traditional sense, IMDA. No warrior courted the famous builder, and she never sought such partnership. But she'd formed deep companionship with healer Kaya. They'd built a life together, sharing a home, knowledge, and affection. The valley accepted their household without comment. Catastrophe had broadened many definitions. Kiona's brother Takara had become a respected builder himself, specializing in intricate lashing techniques. He'd married young Aita after her first husband Kohana died from infected wounds received during the Great Blizzard. Their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, all showed aptitude for construction and learned the craft naturally. Her parents had lived to see her vindication. Napaya became one of her fiercest defenders in council debates, using his warrior status to protect her from those who still resisted women's involvement in building. He never fully apologized for doubting her. His pride prevented such direct acknowledgement. 2-3, but his actions spoke louder than words. He died peacefully at 63 winters. His last words to Kiona, "I was wrong about many things, not about you." Lamasi lived longer, reaching 70 winters. She'd spent those final years teaching young girls that women's knowledge had always mattered. Only now, men were finally listening. Old Armor had died during the Great Blizzard's second night, peacefully and warm in Kiona's curved longhouse. Her ancient bones finally surrendered at 80 winters. Her last words, whispered to Kiona with fierce satisfaction, "I knew. From the moment you were born under strange lights, I knew you'd save us. Die happy now." The most profound moment of Kiona's later life came on an autumn evening in her 40th winter. A young woman of 16, named Nayeli, approached her after a training session. The girl's eyes held the same intense observation that had marked young Kiona 3 decades earlier. "Master Builder," Nayeli said hesitantly, "I've been watching how water flows around stones in the river. I think there might be a way to design roofs that channel snow and ice more efficiently using similar principles. May I show you my sketches?" Kiona's heart swelled with emotion she couldn't name. This was it, the true legacy. Not her specific designs, but the permission to question, to observe, to imagine improvements. She looked at Nayeli's sketches, saw ideas both brilliant and flawed, and smiled with the joy of a teacher recognizing herself in a student. "Yes," she said simply. "Build it. Test it. Learn from it. That's how we honor the ancestors, by doing what they did, which was adapting to survive." That same autumn, Kiona climbed to the northern ridge where her original curved longhouse still stood, now used as communal meeting space. She sat on the stone outcropping where she'd first surveyed the impossible building site 20 winters earlier. The valley below glowed golden with autumn color. New structures with their distinctive curves dotted the landscape. The icy, visible proof that innovation had become tradition, that her desperate gamble had transformed an entire culture's approach to survival. But as she sat, watching the northern sky where weather was born, Kiona noticed troubling signs. The geese flew in confused patterns. The autumn air tasted strange. The color of sunset clouds suggested atmospheric conditions she'd never witnessed. The climate continued changing. New challenges approached, perhaps not the Great Blizzard's catastrophic fury, but different tests requiring different innovations. She thought of young Nayeli with her waterflow sketches, of other apprentices developing their own theories, of the next generation who would face problems she couldn't yet imagine. She'd given them what she could, not perfect solutions, but a way of thinking, a permission to question, a courage to build what wisdom demanded, rather than what tradition prescribed. She thought of the warriors who had mocked her fool's longhouse, and smiled without bitterness. They'd been products of their culture, defending what they knew, protecting what had kept them safe for generations. They weren't villains, but cautious survivors doing their best with the understanding they possessed. The Great Blizzard had killed 47 souls and destroyed 2/3 of the valley's structures, but it had also saved the people, by teaching them hard truths before catastrophe became extinction. Sometimes survival requires breaking what seems sacred. Sometimes wisdom comes from those the wise dismiss. Sometimes the fool is the only one seeing clearly. As stars emerged in the darkening sky, and cold autumn wind whispered promises of winter, Kiona stood and descended toward the valley. Tomorrow she would teach. The day after, she would build. Eventually, she would die, and others would continue the work. That was the true legacy. Impact. Not immortality, but impact. Not fame, but function. Not her own survival, but the survival of the people she loved enough to challenge. The curved walls she'd built would stand long after she was buried. More importantly, the curved thinking she'd taught, flexible, adaptive, willing to question, who would shape how her people approached future challenges. The warriors had mocked her. Fools, Longhouse. The blizzard had proven her wisdom. History would remember that the woman who built wrong by tradition's measure built exactly right for survival. That was enough. That was everything.